I never imagined the moment that would define the rest of my life would begin under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Pennsylvania community hospital. The sterile air was heavy with disinfectant, the beeping monitors pierced through the fog of pain in my abdomen, and every breath felt like it might be my last. At 28 years old, I had grown used to disappointment to being the afterthought in my family, but I had never prepared myself for what my mother was about to say. As I lay curled on the gurney, an oxygen tube fitted beneath my nose, Dr. Rivera's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to get you into surgery tonight. If we wait, the risk of perforation is too high. This cannot be postponed." His words were clipped urgent, leaving no room for argument. I nodded weakly and fumbled for my phone. No matter how strained things were, some part of me still believed that in my darkest hour my parents would finally show up. I dialed home, praying for comfort, for assurance, for even a shred of love. My mother picked up on the second ring. Her voice was bright and cheerful, the kind she used when she was doing something that mattered to her. "Honey, we are at the bakery with Ethan. It is his wedding cake tasting today. You know how important this is." The words landed like a physical blow. For a moment, I thought she had misheard me. "Mom, I am in the hospital," I whispered, panic rising. "They said I need surgery now." There was a pause. Then her sigh came through the line, sharp and impatient. "Sophia, you are strong. You will be fine for a few hours. We cannot just leave Ethan here. He needs us to help choose the right cake." My chest tightened, not just from the illness raging inside me, but from the betrayal that vibrated through every syllable. I croaked, "Dad, are you there?" Richard's voice rumbled in the background, casual, dismissive. "Tell her we will call after." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, disbelief coursing through me. They had chosen buttercream and fondant over blood and flesh. They had chosen a wedding cake over their daughter's life. In the hallway, nurses rushed past with trays of instruments, their sneakers squeaking against polished linoleum, but all I could hear was the echo of my mother's words. A cake tasting was more urgent than my surgery. A cake mattered more than my survival. In that instant, something inside me cracked. This was not the first time they had put Ethan first, not the first time they had treated me as expendable, but this was the moment that stripped away the last fragment of denial. My family had made their choice, and it was not me. I felt tears burn my eyes, but they did not fall. Instead, a kind of cold clarity spread through me, sharp as the IV needle digging into my arm. If I lived through this night, things would never be the same. The monitors beeped faster as my pulse raced. Ellie, the nurse with kind brown eyes, leaned close. "Stay calm, Sophia. We are going to take care of you. Do you want me to call someone else?" Her question sliced through the fog because I knew the answer was yes. I wanted someone, anyone who actually cared if I woke up in the morning. Not my parents, not my brother, not the people who had been absent for years, but someone who would see me as more than an obligation. In that split second, I realized something earth-shattering. Family was supposed to show up to choose you without question, yet mine had chosen cake. I turned my face to Ellie and whispered, "No, do not call them again." The decision felt like a knife cutting a rope that had bound me for nearly 3 decades. If tonight was the end, I would no longer beg for crumbs of love. If tonight was a beginning, it would be the first step toward freedom. That thought carried me as my eyelids grew heavy and the anesthesiologist adjusted the mask over my face. Just before the world went black, I promised myself one thing. If I woke up tomorrow, I would no longer chase the love of people who had proven again and again that they would never choose me. This was not the first time they had abandoned me, but it would be the last. Let me tell you about the note I left behind that shattered them. I grew up in a suburb outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where houses lined the streets with neat lawns and white fences that looked like postcards of the American dream. On the outside, we appeared to be the perfect family, but inside those walls, the balance of love and attention was painfully uneven. My parents, Diana and Richard, had 2 children, Ethan and me. Ethan came 3 years after I was born, and from the moment he arrived, my parents' eyes shifted entirely toward him. I was the oldest, the one who had already learned to tie my shoes and pronounce big words, but suddenly, none of that mattered. When Ethan took his first wobbly steps, everyone clapped as if the world had been reinvented. When I won second place at the county science fair in 7th grade, holding up a ribbon I had worked on for weeks, my mother barely glanced at it before turning away to cheer for Ethan, who had just kicked a soccer ball across the backyard. That was the rhythm of my childhood. My triumphs were background noise to Ethan's smallest efforts. My father, Richard, would sit in the bleachers on Friday nights, bundled in a jacket with a thermos of coffee, shouting Ethan's name during high school football games, his voice hoarse with pride. I remember standing in those same bleachers clutching my honor roll certificate, hoping he would look at me with the same joy. He never did. At home, my report cards earned polite nods while Ethan's mediocre grades were excused with comments like, "He is creative, numbers are not his thing." Diana would beam at him across the dinner table as if a B- in English was a medal of honor, while my straight A's slid unnoticed into the pile of mail. By the time I was 15, I already knew my role. I was the one who figured things out alone, who patched together her own future, while Ethan was showered with endless chances. When I needed a new calculator for math class, I picked up shifts bussing tables at a local diner. When Ethan turned 18, he was surprised with the keys to a used Ford Mustang paid for by our parents. I was stunned, not at the gift itself, but at the way they justified it. "Ethan deserves something nice," my mother said. "You are independent, Sophia. You can handle yourself." Independence became their excuse for neglect. They convinced themselves that because I was resilient, I needed less. What they refused to see was that resilience was just another word for abandonment. I learned to swallow my disappointment quietly. I did not throw tantrums or beg for attention because I knew it was useless. The more invisible I became, the easier it was for them to rationalize Ethan's golden pedestal. Even when I got sick in high school, doubled over with stomach pain that sent me to the ER, my father grumbled about missing Ethan's practice. He dropped me off muttering about medical bills and left to watch the scrimmage. My mother showed up hours later, irritated about rearranging her schedule, reminding me that Ethan had a big game the next day. That was when the seed of clarity planted itself in me, though I would not admit it until years later. In our home, there were 2 children, but only one star. I was the backdrop, the scaffolding that held up Ethan's shine. I carried that knowledge with me into every milestone, every effort, every dream. It carved itself into my sense of worth, whispering that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough to eclipse the chosen son. Adulthood did not shift the balance in my family. It only magnified it. When I earned a scholarship to a state university, I packed my bags with a mix of pride and fear. Tuition was partly covered, but the rest I managed by working double shifts at Target during holidays and Starbucks on early mornings. I studied marketing, pouring every ounce of energy into building a future that could not be taken from me. Ethan, meanwhile, bounced from one failed attempt to another. He enrolled in community college for a semester, dropped out, announced he was starting a landscaping business, and quit before winter. He claimed he wanted to launch an app, but never learned how to code. Each time he stumbled, my parents caught him with soft hands. They called his failures experiments, excuses dressed in optimism. When I visited home on weekends, I watched my father hand Ethan envelopes of cash, watched my mother cook his favorite meals while I was praised for being so self-sufficient that I did not need help. The words stung more than they soothed. Being strong was their reason to abandon me again and again. Once, when Ethan racked up debt from maxing out a credit card, my parents quietly paid it off. When I asked if they could help me with a small student loan, Richard barked, "We cannot do everything for both of you, Sophia. You are the one who has always managed." He did not even look up from the newspaper. That night, I lay awake in my childhood room, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I had stuck to the ceiling years before, wondering if they had ever truly seen me. The gap widened when Ethan brought home Vanessa, a polished woman from a wealthy family who carried herself like royalty. My mother adored her instantly, calling her refined, the perfect match. Vanessa barely spoke to me, her smiles clipped and her eyes critical, but it did not matter. Diana had found her new project another star to orbit. I watched my mother help Vanessa pick bridal magazines while my requests for help scheduling a doctor's appointment were brushed aside. By then, my stomach problems had worsened. I had been diagnosed with a recurring intestinal condition that flared under stress. Hospital visits became familiar, but instead of compassion, I was met with sighs. Richard would grumble about bills. Diana would say, "Could you please not schedule these emergencies when we are busy?" Once, when I called her from the ER, begging her to come, she responded flatly, "Ethan has a big game tomorrow. I cannot stress him out." In that moment, I realized that even pain, even medical urgency, could not compete with Ethan's spotlight. My parents treated my illness as an inconvenience, a distraction from the golden narrative they built around their son. Still, I kept trying. I sent them invitations to my college presentations, offered to bring groceries, searched for scraps of approval. Each time I was met with polite disinterest or excuses. The contrast was cruel. When Ethan landed a temporary job at an auto shop, they threw a small party in his honor balloons tied to the mailbox neighbors invited. When I received an award for maintaining a perfect GPA, Diana barely texted congratulations. The imbalance was no longer subtle. It was blatant, shameless. And yet I could not cut the cord. A part of me still longed for that elusive nod, that fleeting glance of pride. I swallowed the bitterness, convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just held out longer one day, they would see me. But in truth, I was feeding a fire that could never warm me. I was sacrificing my body and spirit on an altar that only ever held Ethan's name. 3 months before Ethan's wedding, when spring still lingered in cool breezes across Pennsylvania and cherry blossoms clung to neighborhood yards, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was unusually warm, the kind that once gave me false hope. "Sophia, we would like you to come to the rehearsal dinner. It is a big night for Ethan, and it would mean a lot if you were there." I hesitated because by then I had distanced myself after too many slights, but something inside me still craved belonging. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed, bought a new dress with my hard-earned paycheck, and told myself perhaps they were finally seeing me as part of the family story. The dinner was held at a banquet room attached to a country club near the Susquehanna River. White linen tablecloths draped neatly over round tables, candles flickered in crystal holders, and a buffet of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air with a comforting aroma. Guests buzzed with chatter about the wedding only weeks away. I stepped inside with cautious optimism, clutching a small gift bag with a set of wine glasses I had saved to buy for Ethan and Vanessa. I wanted to believe my presence mattered. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She wore a fitted white dress hair, swept back in perfect curls, nails manicured to glossy precision. She looked me up and down before murmuring, "Thank you for coming," as though it were an obligation rather than a joy. My mother swept in behind her, hugging Vanessa tightly before patting my shoulder as if I were a coworker instead of a daughter. Ethan was already in the center of the room, laughing, retelling stories of college parties, everyone hanging on his words. I took a seat at the edge of the table, invisible as usual. The toasts began, Richard standing proudly to speak about Ethan's resilience, his bright future, his upcoming marriage. I listened, waiting for even a mention of my name, but there was nothing. When it was Vanessa's father's turn, he bragged about the venue they had booked, a historic church with stained glass windows, and how much the family was investing in this union. Applause followed like waves, and I felt myself shrinking smaller. Then Ethan stood grinning ear to ear. He thanked our parents for financing the $20,000 wedding budget, thanked Vanessa's parents for the engagement party, thanked his friends for bachelor plans in Atlantic City. Not once did his eyes meet mine. By then, a dull ache had begun in my abdomen, the all-too-familiar sign that my illness was flaring. I excused myself to the restroom, gripping the counter as a wave of pain doubled me over. Cold sweat beaded my forehead. I stared at my reflection, pale and trembling, and told myself to hold on. It would pass. When I returned to the table, Vanessa was passing around samples of cake flavors, laughing about red velvet versus vanilla buttercream. Diana leaned in toward me, her smile brittle. "Sophia, try a piece. You will be fine. It is only cake." I shook my head, whispering, "I really do not feel well." The pain was intensifying. My mother's eyes narrowed, and she hissed under her breath, "Do not ruin Ethan's night. You always find a way to make things about you." The words sliced me open deeper than the illness itself. I clutched my stomach, desperate for air, but the room spun with laughter and chatter that excluded me entirely. By the time dessert was served, I could barely sit upright. My father noticed my hand trembling on the fork and muttered, "Stop being dramatic, Sophia. You look fine." The humiliation scorched me. I rose, muttered an apology, and stumbled out of the room. No one followed. Outside, the spring air was cool against my fevered skin. I gripped the steering wheel of my old sedan, praying I could make it home. Every mile blurred my vision fading. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my small townhouse, I was so dizzy I could barely stand. I collapsed in the garage, clutching my side, the sound of crickets echoing in my ears before everything went dark. It was Mrs. Garza, my elderly neighbor, who found me hours later. She had come to drop off a casserole dish she thought I might like. When she saw me lying on the concrete floor, she screamed for help, dialed 911 with shaking hands, and knelt beside me until the ambulance arrived. I drifted in and out of consciousness as paramedics lifted me, their radios crackling. Through the haze, I caught Mrs. Garza's voice trembling. "Stay with us, Sophia. Stay with us." That night, as the sirens wailed through the quiet streets, I realized something I had refused to accept for years. My family would never save me. It was always strangers, neighbors, colleagues, anyone but the people whose love I had chased. And as the darkness closed in, one thought echoed through my mind. My parents had chosen cake over me. When I woke again, the world was a blur of white light and mechanical rhythm monitors beeping steadily above me, tubes trailing from my arms like foreign roots. My throat burned, my abdomen felt carved out, and the ceiling swam as though I were submerged under water. For a moment, I did not know where I was until Dr. Rivera's calm but firm voice anchored me. "You went into emergency surgery, Sophia. We removed the infected section before it perforated. You are very lucky. If you had waited much longer, it could have been fatal." His words pressed down like a weight. Fatal. The word lingered in the sterile air, louder than the machines. I tried to speak, but my lips cracked. "Water," I rasped. Ellie, the nurse with warm brown eyes, lifted a straw to my mouth. She smiled gently. "Welcome back. You gave us a scare." I whispered my parents. "Are they here?" She hesitated, her face tightening, then shook her head softly. "We called them." The doctor explained the urgency. "They said they could not come. They were with Ethan and Vanessa helping with the wedding cake tasting." The words sliced deeper than any scalpel. Even when told their daughter might not survive the night, my parents chose cake over me. I turned my head, tears stinging my eyes, but nothing came out. My body was too weak to cry. Ellie's hand rested on mine. Sometimes the families we create mean more than the ones we are born into. Her voice was tender but steady, as if she had said it many times before to others who had been abandoned. I closed my eyes, her words searing themselves into me. For nearly 3 decades, I had twisted myself into knots, trying to earn love that should have been given freely. But here in the ICU, hovering between life and death, it became undeniable. My family would never choose me. They had proven it again and again, but this was the ultimate verdict. A cake tasting mattered more than whether I took another breath. The thought was devastating and liberating all at once. While I drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of memory surfaced. Ethan blowing out candles on his new Mustang keys while I stood in the corner. Diana clapping for Vanessa trying on dresses while I lay in an ER bed. Richard shouting Ethan's name from the bleachers while ignoring my scholarship acceptance letter. Each memory threaded together into a tapestry of neglect, a pattern I had refused to see until now. By the second night, my condition worsened. My skin broke out in hives, my pulse plummeted. Alarms shrieked, nurses swarmed. Ellie pressed a mask tighter against my face, whispering, "Stay with us." Dr. Rivera explained later that I had suffered a biphasic reaction, a delayed complication that nearly pushed me over the edge. Without immediate intervention, it would have killed me. Again, the question echoed, where were they? While I lay fighting for every breath, my parents were tasting vanilla buttercream and red velvet, debating fondant designs with bakers. The contrast was grotesque. And yet, while my blood family remained absent, others stepped in. Natalie, my colleague from the office, arrived that evening with a small tote bag of essentials. She had noticed I missed work and called until she found the hospital. She sat beside my bed, brushing hair from my forehead, telling me not to worry about presentations that the office was covering for me. Mrs. Garza appeared the next morning with homemade soup in a thermos and updates about my cat, assuring me he had been fed. These people had no obligation, no blood tie, yet they came. They showed up. Each visit etched a painful but undeniable truth. Love was not about DNA or duty. It was about presence. And those who shared my blood had failed the most basic test. On the third day, when the worst had passed, Dr. Rivera sat beside me. "Sophia, do you understand how close this was?" I nodded weakly. "Could I have died?" He looked directly into my eyes. "Yes. Without immediate surgery, you would not have survived the night." The honesty was brutal, but I needed it. It left no room for excuses, no space for denial. My parents' choice was not a misunderstanding. It was abandonment written in bold, carved into the timeline of my life. As I lay staring at the ceiling tiles, I felt the thread of hope I had clung to for years snap at last. The rope that tied me to their approval unraveled, leaving only raw truth behind. I whispered into the quiet room, "They will never choose me." Ellie, adjusting my IV, heard and met my gaze. "Then you must choose yourself." Her words settled in my chest like an anchor. And in that fragile moment, weak and stitched from surgery, I realized that survival would not just mean healing my body. It would mean breaking free. In the quiet days that followed my surgery, when the pain dulled to an ache and I could finally sit upright without gasping, I asked Ellie for paper and a pen. She tilted her head, curiosity flickering, but she brought them without question. The hospital room was still machines humming like background music to my resolve. For years, I had swallowed my disappointment, buried the truth beneath layers of forced smiles and polite phone calls, but now, with the stitches in my abdomen reminding me how close I had come to leaving this world, I knew silence was no longer survival. It was surrender. I began to write. At first, the words came haltingly, my hand trembling from weakness, but soon they poured out decades of hurt, spilling onto the page. I wrote about being 7 years old, clutching my science fair ribbon while my mother turned away to clap for Ethan wobbling on his bike. I wrote about the Friday nights when my father's cheers thundered for Ethan on the football field while I sat invisible on the bleachers holding my honor roll certificate. I wrote about the day I lay doubled over in the ER as a teenager, my mother sighing that Ethan had a big game tomorrow, as though my pain was an inconvenience. I wrote about college working double shifts at Starbucks and Target to pay what scholarships could not, while Ethan's debts were quietly erased and his mistakes reframed as experiments. I wrote about Vanessa sweeping into our family like a queen, my mother orbiting her every need while I fought silently against an illness that gnawed at my body. And then I wrote about the night that had nearly ended me. The rehearsal dinner, my plea for help brushed aside, my father muttering, "I looked fine," my mother accusing me of trying to steal Ethan's spotlight. I wrote about stumbling out into the night, collapsing in my garage, and waking in a hospital bed with tubes in my arms. Finally, I wrote the words that had branded themselves into me. "You chose Ethan's cake over my surgery. You chose buttercream and fondant over the chance to say goodbye to your daughter." These words were not a metaphor. They were fact. I paused, staring at the sentence until the ink blurred with tears. For a long time, I had wanted to believe my parents did not mean harm, that their neglect was oversight, not cruelty. But the evidence was stacked too high. The letter was not for revenge. It was for truth. I drew a line across the page with shaky hands. Until you can acknowledge the pain you have caused, until you can look at the years of abandonment and name them for what they are, I cannot continue pretending our family dynamic is normal. I need space. I need distance. This is not punishment. It is survival. I ended with the words I had never spoken aloud. I am no longer chasing love that should have been freely given. If you cannot choose me in my weakest moment, then I must choose myself. My hand cramped from writing, but I felt lighter, as though each sentence carved weight off my chest. Ellie returned later to check my IV and noticed the sealed envelope resting on the tray. She touched it gently. "Are you sure about this?" I nodded. "When they finally come, give it to them. Leave it on my empty bed." Her eyes softened, but she did not argue. By the 7th day, discharge papers were signed. Natalie arrived to take me home, her car waiting outside. I handed Ellie the envelope, my name written across the front in uneven letters, and she slipped it into her pocket. As I walked out of the hospital doors, each step slow but determined, I felt as though I were leaving not just a ward, but an entire history behind. For the first time in my life, I was not leaving with hope that my parents would change. I was leaving with a declaration that I had changed. The day after I was discharged, while I rested in Natalie's small guest bedroom surrounded by the hum of her apartment and the faint smell of coffee drifting from her kitchen, my parents finally arrived at the hospital. I was not there to see it, but Ellie called me that evening to describe what had happened. Her voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of sympathy. "They came around noon," she said. "They looked perfectly composed, as if they were visiting out of duty, not urgency. When they walked into your room and found it empty, your father frowned, and your mother asked where you were. I told them you had been discharged that morning. Then I handed them the envelope." Ellie paused, and I could almost see it through her words, my mother sitting down on the edge of the hospital bed, tearing open the letter with trembling hands. She read quickly at first, her lips moving silently, but as the pages went on, her face shifted. Her eyes filled, her hand shook. My father stood beside her, his jaw clenched. When she finished, she pressed the letter into his hand. He skimmed it, his face growing red. Then, in a sudden motion, he crumpled the paper into a tight ball. For a moment, he seemed ready to hurl it across the room, but then he hesitated, smoothing it out again with shaky fingers, staring at the words as if he could will them to change. Ellie said they sat there for nearly 45 minutes, mostly silent. My mother wept quietly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue from her purse. My father looked older, heavier, defeated in a way she had never seen before. Finally, they left without a word. The letter folded back into my mother's bag. As Ellie relayed this, I waited for a rush of satisfaction for vindication after years of neglect. But what I felt instead was hollow, empty. The girl inside me, who had once begged for recognition, still ached for them to burst through Natalie's door to finally say, "We were wrong, we love you, we are sorry." But they did not. They retreated into silence, and that silence screamed louder than any apology could. Later that night, Natalie found me staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" she asked softly. I shook my head. They read it. They know the truth. And yet nothing changed. She sat beside me, pressing a mug of tea into my hands. "Sometimes people cannot face the mirror, Sophia. That does not mean your truth is less valid." I nodded, though the ache in my chest was raw. For years, I had been told I was too dramatic, too sensitive, too independent. But now my words were on paper, undeniable, unerasable, and their reaction was to sit in silence and walk away. The next morning, Mrs. Garza knocked on Natalie's door, holding a casserole dish and a small bouquet of daisies. She had heard from the hospital staff that my parents came but left without seeing me. She shook her head, sighing. "They are fools, child. Do not waste your tears on people who cannot value you." Her words warmed me more than I expected. In the span of days, I had learned a lesson most people take a lifetime to uncover. Family by blood may choose to look away, but chosen family shows up even in silence. I looked at Natalie bustling in her kitchen at Mrs. Garza, placing flowers in a vase, and felt the hollowness shift ever so slightly. I was not alone. I had been abandoned, yes, but I was also being held up by hands that did not have to hold me. That I realized mattered more than any apology my parents would never give. Natalie's apartment became my refuge, a quiet second-floor unit in a brick building near downtown Harrisburg, where the hum of traffic replaced the sterile silence of hospital machines. She set up her spare bedroom with fresh sheets and a lamp on the nightstand, insisting I stay as long as I needed. Each morning she brewed strong coffee in a drip pot, the smell filling the small kitchen, and brought me a cup of tea instead, careful not to upset my stomach. She had stocked the fridge with yogurt soup and crackers, saying, "Do not worry about money. We will figure this out." It was the kind of care I had begged my parents for all my life but never received. When I struggled with the stack of insurance paperwork from the hospital, confused by deductibles and copays, Natalie sat at the table with me, highlighting sections, making calls, assuring me I was not alone. Mrs. Garza visited every afternoon, shuffling in with a container of homemade chicken noodle soup or apple pie. Her gray hair tied back in a bun, her wrinkled hands warm as she placed them over mine. She told me stories about her late husband about raising children in the same neighborhood and reminded me that family is who shows up. Her casual words cut deep because they revealed a truth I had missed for years. Love was not loud speeches or big gestures. It was consistency. It was soup delivered in Tupperware rides to doctor appointments, and someone remembering your favorite tea. Dr. Rivera continued to see me weekly, explaining my condition carefully, adjusting medication, answering questions patiently even when I asked them twice. For once, I felt like a human being rather than an inconvenience. One afternoon, after he finished explaining the risks of stress on my immune system, he looked at me seriously. Sophia, if you do not protect yourself from toxic stress, no medication will be enough. I nodded, realizing he was not just talking about food or sleep, but about my parents. Therapy came next. Natalie recommended Lydia a therapist with kind eyes and an office lined with bookshelves. In our first session, Lydia listened as I spilled my childhood memories, my parents' neglect, Ethan's pedestal. She leaned forward and said, "What you are describing is a golden child scapegoat dynamic. Your parents invested everything into Ethan not because you lacked value, but because your independence threatened their need to feel indispensable." The words hit me like a blow. I had spent years wondering what was wrong with me, why I was never enough. Now the answer was clear. It was never about me. It was about their need to control a narrative. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve. I cried for the girl clutching her science fair ribbon unseen. I cried for the teenager in the ER ignored for a football game. I cried for the young woman who collapsed in her garage while her family tasted wedding cakes. The tears came in waves, years of silence breaking open. Lydia reminded me gently, grief is not weakness. It is the recognition of what you lost. Each session left me lighter, more certain that cutting ties was not cruelty, but self-preservation. In the evenings, Natalie and I watched reruns of old sitcoms laughing until my stitches ached. Sometimes she would slide her phone across the table, showing me texts from co-workers sending jokes or memes to cheer me up. Flowers arrived from the office with cards signed by people who barely knew me outside of deadlines, yet here they were showing up. Slowly, I felt warmth filling the cracks left by my family. My body began to heal. The hives faded, my breathing steadied. I could walk around the block with Mrs. Garza without collapsing. But more importantly, my heart began to heal. I realized that chosen family, the people who step in when blood fails, could be stronger than any DNA tie. Sitting one night on Natalie's balcony, the city lights twinkling, I whispered to myself, I deserve this. For years, I had chased crumbs. Now I was being fed with genuine care. The realization was both heartbreaking and liberating. 6 weeks after my discharge on a gray Saturday afternoon, when rain tapped lightly against the windows of my new apartment, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart thudding, because I already knew who it was. Through the peephole, I saw my parents Diana in a tailored navy coat, Richard in a heavy jacket, both standing stiffly as if rehearsing an intervention. For a moment, I considered pretending I was not home, but something in me had shifted since the hospital. I had promised myself I would no longer hide from truth. I opened the door, but did not step aside. "You look well," my mother said awkwardly, her eyes scanning me as if to confirm I had not exaggerated my illness. My father's tone was harsher. "This has gone on long enough. You cannot just cut family off because of one misunderstanding." The words slammed into me, and I felt the familiar temptation to shrink, to apologize, to beg for peace. But I stood straighter. This is not about one misunderstanding. This is about years of abandonment. This is about the night I nearly died while you chose a wedding cake over me. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Diana tried a softer tactic, guilt dripping from her voice. "Do you know how much you have hurt us with that letter, Sophia? People are asking questions. Ethan is upset." My father leaned on dismissal. "You filled his fiancé's head with nonsense about us being bad parents. We gave you everything we could." My voice shook, but I held firm. "You gave me nothing when it mattered. You missed my surgeries, my graduations, my life. You made me invisible so Ethan could shine. And when I needed you most, you were debating frosting flavors." Richard's face reddened. "That is not fair. You exaggerate. Everyone in this family has sacrificed. I shook my head. Sacrifice means showing up. You never showed up for me. My mother's eyes welled, but instead of apology, she reached for manipulation. We only wanted you to be strong. You never needed us the way Ethan did. That line, the one I had heard all my life, finally rang hollow. My strength was never a reason to abandon me. It was the excuse you used to justify neglect. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but instead of fear, there was clarity. I had spent nearly 3 decades yearning for their validation, but now I saw them clearly, fragile in their excuses, desperate to maintain a story that no longer held power over me. I crossed my arms. I am not going to keep explaining my pain to people who refuse to acknowledge it. If you want to talk, call first. If I say no, respect it. Do not show up uninvited again. My father's jaw tightened. This is not over. I met his eyes steady. You are right. It is not over. It is the beginning of me valuing myself. Then I closed the door slowly but firmly, the click of the lock echoing like a gavel. My chest heaved, my hands trembled, but I did not collapse. For the first time, I stood on the other side of the door without guilt pressing on my lungs. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Mom and Dad are upset. Dad says you have changed. Mom will not stop crying. What happened? I stared at the screen, then typed back simply, I stood up for myself. After a long pause, he replied, I think I need to learn how to do that too. His words glowed on the screen, fragile but real, and I felt a flicker of something I had thought dead hope, not for my parents, but for the possibility that my brother might one day step out of the shadow they had built around him. I set the phone down, exhaling, realizing that confrontation had not broken me. It had freed me. 6 months have passed since that confrontation, and my life now feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone who finally chose herself. I moved into a modest but sunlit apartment in Philadelphia, a place with hardwood floors that gleam in the morning light, and windows that I keep open to let the city breathe around me. I invested in a high-quality air purifier, not just because my doctors recommended it for my condition, but because it symbolizes control over my own environment, something I never had growing up. Dr. Rivera still checks in regularly, guiding me through medications and lifestyle changes, and for the first time in years, my body feels stable. The flare-ups are rare now, the hives gone, my breathing steady, but the deeper healing has been within. I built a circle of people who show up without being asked. Natalie, once just a colleague, has become a true friend. We share dinners at her kitchen table, laugh over reruns, and lean on each other the way family should. Mrs. Garza calls weekly with recipes and stories about her garden, often reminding me to come by for soup. She has become the grandmother I never had. Even my co-workers, people I once thought of only in terms of deadlines and meetings, check in with texts or invitations. Small gestures that remind me I am valued. These relationships are simple, consistent, and real, untainted by the constant hunger for approval that defined my childhood. My parents call once a month, their voices polite but shallow. I answer only when I feel strong enough. Our conversations are brief, focused on the weather or Ethan's plans, never the letter, never the night that almost ended me. I no longer cling to hope that they will transform. Instead, I accept them as they are, limited and unwilling. Strangely, that acceptance has freed me more than their approval ever could. Ethan, however, has surprised me. 2 months after my hospitalization, he called, his voice quieter than I remembered. He admitted he had moved out of our parents' house. He confessed that he and Vanessa had rehomed the dog they never truly wanted. That much of his life had been about seeking attention rather than discovering himself. Your letter made me think, he said. For the first time, I wondered what it was like for you. We now meet once a month for coffee. Our bond is fragile, but honest, stripped of the favoritism that poisoned our childhood. It is not perfect, but it is real, and that feels like more than enough. Therapy with Lydia continues to guide me. She reminded me that healing is not linear. There are days when I feel the old urge to overachieve, to bend myself into impossible shapes for approval that will never come. But now I recognize those impulses as echoes, shadows of a role I no longer play. I remind myself of Ellie's words in the ICU. Sometimes the families we create mean more than the ones we are born into. Each day I believe that more deeply. Forgiveness has also found its way into my heart, but not in the way my parents might want. Forgiveness, I have learned, does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean reopening doors that were closed for survival. It means releasing the grip of anger so it no longer poisons me. I have forgiven them for what they could not give because I know their failures come from wounds of their own. But forgiveness does not mean staying. It means stepping forward unburdened. I no longer sacrifice myself for crumbs of affection. My worth was never something to earn. It was mine all along. If you are listening to this and you have been the overlooked child, the scapegoat, the one who worked endlessly for love that never came, hear me now. You deserve better. Your value is not measured by someone else's recognition. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting for love from those who cannot give it and build a life with people who can. That is what I have done. That is what saved me.